I don't know about you, but as I was preparing for this presentation, I was feeling so much sensation. It's a sensational topic, the erotic. And we want it to be that way. We want it to be sensational. So if you're coming in and you're feeling excited, if you're feeling anticipation, or if you feel some fear or anxiety or even shame, um, let's welcome it all. Let's welcome all of that in. You're welcome along with it. I often think nobody wants to say, my sex life is void of sensation. My erotic life is absolutely calm. In fact, when we think of the erotic, we often associate it with an idea of aliveness, of being full of sensation. And yet, when the sensations start coming up around it, it can be really challenging. It can be really uncomfortable. And so, one of the very first things I want to do is to give a lot of approval for all of those sensations that come up when we talk about the erotic. So, throughout this session, if you feel any of those things, if you feel repulsion, if you feel anxiety, if you feel fear or hesitation, or if you feel really sexually turned on, if you feel a lot of electricity in your body, all of that, all of that is part of the erotic. Now, like I said, we can often think something is wrong when we feel that way, that we need to turn away or we want to calm it down. We want to make it comfortable. But one of the very first things we discover when we move towards pleasure is that the deepest pleasure requires us being uncomfortable with things that can feel challenging, that can feel intense, that actually requires that we learn to be at home there. So I'm going to invite you to invite all of these sensations into this session, and we can investigate them together in our time together here for the next 50 minutes. And I see someone putting in the chat there about feeling like they're bad at sex. If you have questions or if you have reflections you want to share as we go along, please feel free to put them there. I might not answer right away, but I'm going to keep track and I'm going to come back there. And also, like Gabby mentioned, you can put your questions and you can vote up ones that you especially want to see answered. So before we go much further, I want to invite us all to pause and take a moment and drop into our bodies and feel what's there. Like I said, to notice all of the sensation, to not just seek out the ones that are comfortable or what we think of as pleasurable, but to feel all of it. So whatever works for you to drop in, maybe you want to close your eyes for a minute or just let your gaze be soft and feel inside of your body and notice, is there heat? Is there pressure? Or is there stillness? Is there swirling motion or is there vibration? Maybe your heart is racing or you're sweating a little or you feel some pressure in your chest. And make sure that you check out your genitals too. How do they feel? It's not often that we stop in mindfulness and feel how our genitals feel, but include it all. You might even notice that some of the sensations you're feeling, if they're uncomfortable, might be sensations that you would actually crave in sex. Like if you're feeling that heat, if you're feeling your heart racing, if you're feeling a pressure in your chest, those can be the exact sensations that we crave in the erotic, even if we think right now, like, wow, it's uncomfortable, or wow, it's a lot to feel. So noticing that too. Or you might notice that you feel kind of numb, maybe disconnected or cut off. One of my teachers, she's now passed, her name was Ruth Dennison, a really brilliant German teacher of Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. She used to say, darling, Numbness is a sensation too. And that was so brilliant for me because all of those areas where I would think, I can't feel, but I can't feel anything. Maybe there's something even more wrong with me, is to actually get curious there. Oh, numbness is a sensation too. So notice how numbness feels. How does disconnection feel? Bring in some curiosity. Oh, this is how numbness feels in my body. So take a moment and notice. And know as you're doing this, this is the first key to converting pain to pleasure. It's being connected to and unafraid to explore sensation. So turning to, being curious, being approving of whatever's there. And if you want to share some of the sensations, like Leslie already jumped in. Thank you so much, Leslie, saying like, yeah, numb and disconnected. So who else felt some sensations? If you felt numbness, if you felt electricity, if you felt a pressure or tingling, if you want to share some of the sensations, Giselle said, nothing, my anger turned to sadness. Yeah, that is not uncommon. And then I'm curious if you actually ask yourself, oh, anger, well, how does anger feel in my body? Is it like a heat or is it cool? Is it like a tension in my jaw or is it soft? You can start noticing, how does it show up in my body? Other people said sweat in my chest, heart racing, tense jaw, hunger, hunger, that's a good one. Hunger, one of those things we could think of as bad, but wow, in the erotic, hunger can feel so good. Tingling in my face, a heavy, fuzzy constriction in my throat, hollow, empty tension in my jaw, pulsing, frustration. Again, so frustration can be one. How does frustration feel in my body? Is it like tight? Is it vibrating? Is it hot? So getting curious, pulsing. Someone says overwhelmed, like I could not stay in my body. Okay, so that's also good to notice. This is what overwhelm feels like. Staying with it as long as you can. And then sometimes we just hit our edge. This is called our range, right? We can stay with it so long, and then we start to feel like we're going to go unconscious. So part of our practice here is to expand our capacity to stay conscious with intense sensations, whether they're intense because it's numb or intense because it's painful or intense because it's simply an intense, strong sensation. So as we develop our consciousness, it's not to overwhelm ourselves, but to discover how long our capacity for consciousness can stay with us. So, and like I mentioned, our willingness to turn towards what feels unpleasurable can ultimately lead to pleasure. So it's not just enduring them. And that's one thing I really want to emphasize right from the beginning here. We're not aiming to endure. Sometimes we think like, oh, wow, I feel really tense. I'm going to really try to stay with it and hold on. Okay, so actually what we're aiming to do, can we relax while staying present? Can we bring in that feeling? We bring in some safety, a sense it's okay to feel this. And if we can't, we can take our attention off of it and move to something else. And I want to also mention that here throughout this session, if you ever feel overwhelmed, there's a couple of places you could go. Think of where it feels neutral in your body. Maybe your two hands touching, or where your feet are contacting the ground, or your butt's on the chair. You could just bring your attention there, somewhere that's more neutral for you, and ground. And that's helpful too, to know that's part of developing our ability to stay present with the erotic, is knowing when we need a pause. So please also use that. So this is the very beginning. We're hopping in right away and exploring, how do we turn towards these sensations? Sensations that actually we're not looking to quiet down. We're not looking to smooth over, though that might be our habit. But we're actually looking to find the aliveness inside of them. And we're going to go into this a lot more in this session. But what I want to first tell you is uh, when I do this work with people, they often say, like, well, were you always turned on? Were you always able to do this? Like, how was it for you? And the answer is unequivocally no. I was absolutely not turned on. And in fact, in the face of intense sensation, it was incredibly hard for me to stay present. Now, that doesn't mean that I was someone who was walking around completely disconnected from my body. Like probably many, many of you, if you're at this conference, you probably already know something about embodiment, or you've had a sense that there was something there. My guess is a lot of you do practices. And, also was mentioned in my bio that Gabby said, is I've practiced insight meditation, which is a mindfulness body-based meditation for almost 25 years now. So by the time that I came to the erotic, I'd already been practicing for over 10 years. And I, in fact, was beginning a 5-year teacher training with my teacher, Jack Cornfield, who's an amazing teacher of mindfulness. He's actually presenting here soon in 4 days, I think on October 22nd. So you could also catch his session. Uh, and so I had spent a tremendous amount of time sitting with myself in silence, in solitude, in stillness, learning to feel my sensation. Genitals weren't necessarily included for any of you. Maybe some of you have sat a meditation retreat before, especially if you sat like my very first, which was a 10-day Vipassana. It was very common that we would be taught, scan the body and feel all the sensation, and guided to feel throughout the entire body. And then suddenly the genitals would be skipped. We could name, shoulders, chest, belly, hips, legs, feet. And so this was my many, many years of mindfulness and meditative practice. Not that it was intentionally done with harm by any teacher in any way whatsoever. But it was a practice of learning to be present with myself that just happened to cut off the intense sensations of the erotic. And what I found was I would go on long retreats, 2 months, 3 months. I did several of them. And inside of those retreats, I would feel this incredible ease. I'd feel this at home in myself. Uh, Amongst the silence and the stillness and the solitude, being alone, I could feel safe. Now, I don't know if any of you have that experience inside your practices, like you have a practice where you can feel safe and you can feel that. And then what would happen is I would come out of retreat and suddenly I would be in the realm of motion, of speaking, of not silence, of connection, of not solitude. And it was in the face of the intensity of that experience, I would feel completely overwhelmed. I wonder if any of you have that kind of experience, where you have your safe place, like maybe you're at home or it's in a dance class, or where you're in a place that's more still. But then suddenly when you come into connection, or when you come into the realm of the erotic, it feels like it's too much. Maybe if you want to raise your hand, if you have that kind of experience, where suddenly it feels like your ability to stay present, your ability to be with your sensation vanishes. And that was the case for me. It was like suddenly I'd come out of these retreats and it would be faced with human connection, with the intensity of the world. And it was like I lost everything that I had felt in the beauty of this more refined environment. And, at the same time, I was also in partnership with someone who felt like should answer all of my desires for relationship, all of my desires for the erotic, in our attractiveness for him, in our values and what we love doing together. Like it was like every box was checked. And yet I was missing a feeling of aliveness. So when I would be in this relationship, I think, what is wrong with me? And I don't know if some of you have also had that experience. What is wrong with me? I should be turned on. I should feel good here. I should be gratified by sex, and yet I'm not. And maybe something's wrong with me. And that was my question that I came into my erotic exploration with, was maybe I'm not sexual, or maybe this whole domain is not for me. In fact, maybe I am meant to be a nun. That was a serious consideration for me. Maybe I'm meant to spend my life on retreat, or maybe I'm meant to spend my life alone in a more still, safe, silent environment where I could feel at ease, because I didn't feel at ease in this world. So I sat with that question. Is my life going to be about retreat? Literally retreating from the world. And it says, is this question true for all genders? Yeah, absolutely. All genders. So, to look at, there might be, you might feel like this might feel like, oh, this is more relevant for women, but for some men as well, you could look at like, how is this true for you? Men have a lot of pressure on their sex as well, on their performance, on how they are, internally expecting to be. So, so then there's that question of maybe the erotic isn't for me. Maybe I'm not a sexual person. And I was talking with a friend about this, a friend who was also in my teacher training, who'd also spent many years as a monastic in Burma, but then had turned and faced this question himself. And he said, I know some teachings that can help you with this. And he started to describe to me his own journey into exploring sexuality and exploring the erotic. And as he told me, I just felt this sensation of disgust wash over me, this feeling of repulsion, like I am never going to do that. Now, I don't know if any of you have that feeling right now, or maybe you've had that feeling when turning towards sexuality. It's just almost like a magnet in reverse, that feeling of disgust or that feeling of trepidation, that feeling of fear. And I just said, no, thank you. But of course, I left our conversation and it was like a seed was planted in me. And maybe it was 2 months, 3 months, that seed germinated. And now I've come to call that seed desire. Maybe that's what brought you here to this session, was a sense that a desire for something to be possible. And I wonder also if any of you have had that. Again, you can raise your hand or put it in the comment box, where somebody has said something, or you've heard of something, or you felt a desire arise, and what you felt was repulsed. What you felt was disgusted. What you felt was, no way, I'm never going to do that. Or you saw someone else do something or have something that possibly secretly you wanted, but was a lot to feel. And that's just the truth of desire. Desire often destabilizes who we think we are and how we feel. Again, just like pleasure, we have this idea of like, oh, it will be easy. Oh, like desire is all about just, of course, I'm just going to want it. It's going to be that I'm going to so effortlessly move towards it. But desires, especially in the erotic and these deeper desires, can touch on places in our conditioning that contain a lot of fear, that contain a lot of hesitation or ambiguity, or like, I want it and yet I don't want it. And so when we face desire like this, we can often feel repulsion. And so again, this ties back to where I started, with the willingness to feel something uncomfortable. And the second key to converting pain to pleasure is our willingness to feel, to listen to, and to follow desire. Now, that might not mean you're able to do it right away. Like for me, it was about 2 months, 3 months. I think it was 3 months of saying, hell no, there is no way I'm doing that, before I could gather the courage to actually listen to and notice that it was desire. So right now, you could even ask yourself, what might be a desire that I'm feeling? And I'm curious, again, if you want to put in the chat, what is a desire that you're feeling for your erotic life? and for your sexual life. And I'm actually I want to pause for a second because I want to tell you a little bit about what I mean by the erotic. Because you might have picked up so far that I'm not just talking about sex, like I'm not just talking about intercourse as the erotic. Uh, in fact, the idea of eros, of the erotic, goes back like well over 3,000 years in Western history, not to mention, the countless other cultures, likely thousands of years further behind. Sex has been here since the beginning of human existence, or the beginning of animal existence. And so in 500 BCE, even, for Greeks, the erotic came from chaos. There was the void of chaos, and it gave birth to the creative impulse of eros, and that's what created physical existence. Or other legends speak of eros as desire, which brought together heaven and earth, and that created this material world. Plato talked about eros as an intermediary between humans and the divine. And then more recently, Freud talked about it as life instinct. And this is how I work with it. Is the erotic is this experience of life energy. You could think of it as creative impulse, or spark of desire that flows through us. And we can most intensely feel it most often in sex, or we can feel like we want to feel it. That's what our desire is, to feel it. And when we can't feel it, there's a frustration. Because, if you think of that, the erotic is aliveness. We all desire to feel alive. And I'm seeing some desires here. I want to pause and look at them. And someone says, I'm an empath and I desire to be able to hold on to myself and not be taken over by someone else's needs and feelings. Lisa, we're going to talk about desire and boundaries in the session. So that is really brilliant. Someone else says, a joined spiritual connection fuels an organic, orgasmic flow. Yes. Desiring openness, freedom, satisfaction, deep intimacy, a desire to serve. That's beautiful. Thank you, Gabby. To be fearless and not be shy. I'm going to invite you in that one to say, you might have heard this before, of course, but fearlessness, I would say, is overrated. I feel fear all the time. I felt fear before this Zoom started. And fear is life energy flowing through you. Like I said at the beginning, I really want to invite you into this inquiry. Take it on and check it out for yourself. The Buddha in his teachings always said, ehipassiko. Ehipassiko means try it on and check it out for yourself. Don't believe anything I say, but actually feel it into your own experience. So feel in your own experience. If you feel fear, how does it feel in your body? Is it possibly a feeling of anticipation and aliveness? Before I came on Zoom, I know this well enough now. I've been teaching in the erotic for well over 10 years. But when I started, every class I used to teach, I would be filled with so much dread. I'm naturally an introvert. There's a reason I could spend months on silent retreat, and I would just feel this like shivering in my body and this contraction and all of these feelings, until one day when I realized, as I was walking up the stairs to teach a class, wait, this is the exact energy I need to teach this class. This electricity flowing through my body, this incredible sense of heat and aliveness. So I want to invite you too, when you feel fear or when you feel anxiety, notice how it actually feels and just ask yourself, could potentially this be an experience of aliveness moving through you, an experience of energy, wanting to be expressed, wanting to move into desire, wanting to serve. When someone said serve, if we don't have access to this energy, we can't be of service. We can't come from a lifeless place. And Wilhelm Reich in the 1920s actually picked up on this. He was one sort of the next generation after Freud. And he talked about orgastic potency. And what he said was, it's the capacity to surrender to the flow of biological energy. And that sounds like very kind of rationally spoken, but really what it means is being free of inhibitions that life can move through us. And when we're free of inhibitions in this way, we can experience this aliveness, and we can actually let the erotic fully come through and out of us. And so this is what we're doing in the erotic. This is why we learn to work with sensation and to listen to desire. We might think like, oh, what does anxiety and fear have to do with like having a great orgasm, or really being able to get off in sex and that we want, or to have this great intimate connection? Well, truly, it has everything to do with it. So when I came finally, after months of repulsion and hesitation and internal arguing with my own desire, when finally I was able to say, okay, I will surrender. I will surrender. And maybe this word for you even brings up something, to even hear the word surrender, what it would mean to surrender to all of this sensation in your body. I met with my very first coach, and they looked at me and they said, yeah, you can't feel the erotic because you're too messed. Now, you might have heard that word before. You might kind of wonder, what does that mean, too messed? I think it sort of was classically used in romance novels and things like this as engorgement. But tumescence essentially is where energy is expanding but not released. And Eros wants to move, right? Like I'm saying, it wants to create, it wants to express this aliveness that's coming through us. And yet all of us, for instance, me, I had my habit of introversion, my fear, my perfectionism, resentment, our conditioning, all of these things that we have that prevent us from expressing our erotic. And someone says, how is that word spelled? Tumescence. Tumescence. I'm going to put it in the chat box here. Tumescence. Or tumescence is the word. And I'm using an extrapolation of it in this way. Reich talked about it as like a psychosocial armor, that when this energy wanted to flow through us, but we block it, is that we end up more rigid. And you can just think of anything that wants to flow, and that doesn't. If there's anything that wants to flow and doesn't, swamps, rust, clots, gridlock, you can think of your own version. And this is, how Reich described this. But even recently, I don't know if anyone else attended Gabor Mate's session. It was so brilliant. I listened to it a couple of days ago as part of this conference. And in his work, he deeply talks about when we have life that wants to move through us, when we have emotions that want to move through us, and we block them because of trauma, because of cultural conditioning, because of systematic injustice, for all of these reasons, that when that happens, that is where disease can be created. Not the only reason for disease, but an incredibly contributing factor. And in the same way here, when this life energy wants to move and we block it, then we start to feel this dis-ease, right? Or Reich would say this physical psychosomatic armoring, what I call tumescence. In fact, one of the things that I talk about with my clients is that every feeling withheld or blocked, every desire held back, unacknowledged, or a truth that you don't feel safe expressing, ultimately it's like a layer on your genitals, a layer on your clit, a layer on your sex, that is that kind of armoring. Now, that doesn't mean we have to walk around and acting out every single thing, but it's like I said in the beginning, it's about a willingness to be intimate and to feel it. So we can remember this, and think about this. And I'm glad people are sharing about Wilhelm Reich, really brilliant work. You can look him up, and about working with the erotic in this way. And ultimately, what the way that he described it was that when we don't have this flow, we end up with a certain kind of impotence. we can't let life flow through us. And when you think about in our, especially Western society, but I really believe majority of cultures throughout the world now, there's so much constriction around this, and we all have layers over our sex. We all have some experience of tumescence. And thank you for referring to that Gabor Mate talk. I highly recommend everyone listens to that. He's a real genius in talking to these things about what it looks like to really trust our inner instincts and let them flow, so life doesn't get caught, but actually can be expressed. And ultimately, we're talking about the same thing, but here in the erotic realm. So what I want to move into is about desire. And if you can think about the last time that you had a desire, or you wanted to express something, or you felt an impulse towards connection, but instead you held it back. Like instead you blocked it, and how you felt. So if you even so drop into your body and notice, like, how did you feel when you had a desire? Like it might have been a little desire rise up. It might have been a communication, just the most subtle thing. Or you might have been with a lover and felt like, oh, I wanted to tell him, like, go a little softer there. Or you wanted to ask her, like, would you touch my head? Whatever it is, but you didn't say it. How did it feel? So thinking about that. And if you want to share what you noticed when you held back on that desire. And I see someone here, the question about sublimating. I'll talk to that. So, but first of all, thinking about what you notice there and how you feel. Someone says, my throat got stuck, or like nauseous, burning, shame. I felt alone and disconnected from my partner. I think Brene Brown says shame is made up of, I wish I remember, there's 3 things she says, but basically it's that feeling of like, it's not okay. It's like, it's separation. If anyone remembers the 3, you can put them up here because they're really brilliant. And it really speaks to that, how it increases that feeling of separation. Enthusiasm not shared. Cage, I stopped feeling my body. Thank you, Rosie. Because when we come back to numbness, it's like, oh, suddenly that thing wanted to come through me and I wouldn't let it. And then all of this happens, switched off, lonely, like I'm a loser. It's a really intense one, but so true, that habitual conditioned disapproval we have towards desire. Now, when I was first working with my teacher in the erotic, and she looked at me and she said, it's not that you're not sexual. It's not that you don't have the erotic. It's not that you, in fact, don't have so much erotic wanting to move through you. In fact, it actually might be that you have too much, like so much that's held back, that what you're experiencing instead is pain. That all of that energy of life wanting to move through you, you walk out of a retreat and there's so much that wants to be expressed. There is so much desire and it meets fear and you hold it back. And then all you could feel is an overwhelm or numbness. That's not that it's not enough erotic. It's not that you're not sexual. It's actually that you have so much of that. And the work is to unlock it. So, if you're someone, people have been mentioning a lot of these feelings here. Here's some symptoms of tumescence. And you might think of like, oh, where have I been feeling these recently? Oh my gosh, how to unlock it. We're going to get to that next. So if you've been feeling lethargy, like a malaise, someone mentioned that kind of feeling, right? When you hold back, or agitation or resentment. How about resentment? I hold back my desire and then what happens? I'm pissed at my partner because they didn't figure it out without me saying it. A lack of creativity. Suddenly we feel just sort of cut off from our inspiration, from the muse. Block self-expression or introversion. For me, it's like, gosh, how much of that pulled back from life, that incredibly painful introversion, not like a naturally rejuvenating introversion, but that feeling of being disconnected from life, hopelessness, self-doubt, lack of libido, even physical pain. And I'm not talking about physical pain that has like a clear source of something, but this kind of overall feeling of like achiness or like tension in the body. Or, contrarily, we might have that feeling of hungry ghost, like we're trying to do everything to fulfill a desire, but not the real desire. We don't say the real desire and we go and eat 10 cookies instead. Like we don't actually have the sexual nourishment, so we go smoke cigarettes. These compensatory desires. And so then desire ends up getting a bad name. So these are all ways that we might experience tumescence. And someone said, clean the house like a mad lady. Absolutely. Like, I'm going to control this environment. If I'm going to have to control myself, I'm going to control everything around me. If there's any other control freaks out there, you might also feel it that way. All of this is the erotic. It's all the erotic, just looking for ways to come through you. And so if you felt like someone who's like, maybe I'm not sexual, maybe I'm disconnected from my sex, let me tell you, you have it. Absolutely. I go crazy reading of everything about sexuality, right? Again, it's like, let me fix it. It's like we spin out. So thinking about, if you feel all those things, like, oh, if you turn towards it as, this is life force wanting to come through me. This is the aliveness of sensation wanting to come through me, circling back to where we started at the beginning. In those moments when you feel like you're reaching for your 10th cookie, you're frantically running around cleaning your house, meanwhile resenting your partner like crazy in your mind. If instead, like, you find yourself on the internet researching because you're so desperate for an answer, take a moment and notice how you feel inside. And I'm going to even say, don't necessarily do it to try to smooth out that feeling. So automatically we can feel that, and then we want to take a deep breath and calm ourselves down. Instead, notice the aliveness. Notice your genitals. Notice if there's a buzzing, if there's an intensity of feeling, and see if you can open to that. So see how that feels. Like I said, this morning, I got to feel it even before this presentation. And unfortunately, I have enough experience with it to know, like, okay, here comes my download of energy. So I want to invite you to look for that, this willingness to acknowledge, to open to it and approve of it, and to get curious and to let it come through you. And a big piece of that is desire. So I want to come back when someone said, oh my God, how do we do this? I get how the aliveness is present in buzzing situation. How is lethargy and disconnection? Okay. So when we feel, and actually in Gabor Mate's work, which I really adore, he talks about people who fall into certain categories of illness have a rigid, this is actually, I wrote down what he said, a rigid and compulsive identification with duty, with responsibility and with others rather than the true self, a compulsive and automatic regard for the needs of others without considering their own. Or even he mentions this adverse childhood experiences study, that when you have adverse childhood experiences like abuse or violence or mental illness in the family, drug addiction, and when our childhood boundaries, our ability to assert what actually feels good to us are or maybe they're violated or they didn't even exist, that then we don't have this internal sense of who we are, or even to know what is it that we desire, what do we want, how do we go forward with it. And then we often experience things like depression with a lack of desire, with numbness, with disconnection. And it's not that you don't have desire, it's that you've been disconnected from it, from all of these things. I know, actually, I think just before me was Betty Martin on this channel talking about the wheel of consent and about boundaries. Desire and boundaries are inextricably connected. You can't know what your boundaries are if you don't know what your desire is. Like, oh, what do I desire? I desire to feel this way. I desire to experience this thing. It's the foundation of being able to assert and express what you want. And if you're feeling lethargy, I'd ask you, how connected are you to your desire? If you feel disconnected or numb, just start looking at, what might I desire? Now, and I just want to mention, I see Gabby the time. So I'm gonna talk about this, and then when I want to open it up to answer some of these questions. So if you've been asking questions and you want to vote up any, I'm going to get to them in a couple of minutes. But I first of all briefly want to talk about desire, because it's so key here. When I say desire, what are some words that come to mind for you? And again, you can put them into the chat. And now you say here, desire or compulsion. Thank you for that question, because it's so key. Because again, people, when you hear desire, you might hear compulsion. You might hear addiction. You might hear selfish. I'm curious, what do you hear when you hear desire? Or when you think of someone who goes for their desire? When you think of a woman or a man who's fearless? Sin. That is a powerful word. Someone also mentions like thrilling, pleasure. Someone says ego and greed. Courage, right? So we have a lot of ideas. You know, some of the ones I wrote down, like selfish, greedy. Hello, I studied Buddhist meditation. I've been studying it for 25 years. It can often is even mistranslated as, you know, desire is the root of suffering. It's actually not what it is. Clinging is the root of suffering. And someone says that, compulsion. My experience from working with clients is that compulsion and addiction actually come when we don't have our deepest desires met. It's the compensatory. It's like that, like going online and researching or eating the cookies, because we're not actually feeding the more tender desires that are underneath there. Often, again, because they're quite destabilizing. And so we have all of these associations with desire. What does it mean for someone to follow their desire? So to be aware of that, again, desire probably brings up a lot of sensation inside of yourself. How does it feel to feel all of this desire? And then to pause and to ask yourself, what's a little something that I want? What's something that I want? What's a desire? And like I mentioned earlier, it might destabilize your sense of identity. Certainly as a Buddhist, a practitioner, teacher in training, potential nun, to say, I'm going to go and study the erotic for 12 years. That was quite a destabilization of my identity. But, you know, desire can also kind of be a gift of freedom that way. It's like separating from that tyranny of what you believe other people think and what you believe other people perceive about you. And when we start listening to our desire, it comes from a place of deeper guidance. You know, I think like Gabor Mate refers to it as like that inner self, which he asserts that the connection to that inner self is sort of that ultimate, that's the guide to take us out of the knots of contraction and potential disease. If someone says, is desire soul and is desire the same as flow? I would say desire comes from our soul. And that when we are in connection with desire and expressing it, it gives us that feeling of flow. And that feeling of flow is the feeling of the erotic moving through you. So it doesn't need to make sense. It doesn't mean that if you have a desire, you're going to get everything that you want. But the practice is to listen to it. Desire is the voice of the erotic. And I want to invite you after this call, because I know I'd love to have time to do it all, but I don't, is for you to, after this call, take 5 minutes even and start writing a desire list. What if you wrote down and put that internal judge aside for a moment, all the one that says sin, obsession, clinging, selfish, capitalist, whatever the damning word for you is, and just say, I'm just going to let my desire speak. And then see how you feel. See how you feel. And what would it be like to start listening to that? And maybe even to start expressing some of it. That ability to express what's true for you. There's so many questions here. I want to take a few minutes and answer some of them. So which ones do we have that pop up the most, Gabby?
Sure. I'm so glad, Justine, that you offered that homework as well, because there's so much bubbling up for me. And this really is just a seed that you've planted. So looking at the Q&A, a lot of folks have upvoted this one in particular from Carol. Thank you, Carol. I'll read it out. I also have pain that often keeps sex from being pleasurable and sometimes painful.
Mhm.
That and depression and medication really dampens desire, even if I really love and want to be with my partner. So it sounds like what might you recommend for that sort of challenge?
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Like where it actually can manifest as physical pain in the body. So there's a few things. The very first thing that I would say is make intimacy with your own desire a priority. And I don't mean necessarily it has to be in the bedroom or with your partner, but just start. What if you getting to know your own desire was one of the number one things in your life? And again, it doesn't mean that you have to act on it, that you have to think it all makes sense, it's rational, my partner's going to want it. Just start by saying, I'm willing to listen to that voice inside, to that inner self. And be curious. Write about it every day. Every morning wake up and say, I'm willing to write down 10 desires. Maybe is there even a desire that I can let myself. Today I went to the farmer's market and bought myself these flowers because I have a desire every Sunday to have beautiful flowers in my house. And so it's simple. What might be something for you that's a start? And you can think like, well, that's desire. Then how does that connect to sex? It's all connected. As we start listening to that part inside of us and it gains our trust, that inner voice that maybe we have so often discounted. So it thinks, oh, I can't even be bothered to say anything anymore. As we start to listen, and then we're developing our relationship with our desire so that we can speak it out more easily. And then that's where it starts to apply in sex, to be able to ask for what we want, to actually know, and then to examine. Like, oh, do I want it a little lighter or a little firmer? Do I want my partner to touch me faster or slower? But first of all, we have to really get intimate with our own desire and that voice, that inner voice that's going to be telling us. And so that is where to listen. And again, to know sometimes where there's intensity, it's actually a lot of backed up erotic, a lot of backed up sexual energy, and very gently to be willing to go towards it. Uh, this is something that there's so much more to say about it, but I want to really, really punctuate that is that intimacy with your own desire and to be curious. And the one last thing is that I do teach a practice called orgasmic meditation, which is a mindfulness practice of sexuality, actually of stroking the clitoris with no goal for 15 minutes. And it's done between two partners in a very safe and contained way. And it's for many, many women with pain or anorgasmia, found it really effective for learning to contact their desire and gradually be able to feel more eroticism. And you can look it up. There's actually free videos online that you can also learn it from. So I really also recommend that. Do we have time for one more, Gabby?
Yeah, sure. We might even have time for two more.
Oh,
So some folks are also curious about desires in general. People deal with
good.
depression, doubt, a lot of that work, and it can be really maybe
Yes.
intimidating or overwhelming to even know where to start. Can you speak to that a little bit and to those blocks?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I also see someone here like, what do you mean about like getting intimate with our desires or desire in general? Uh, so I think there's one thing that we sort of found throughout this conference, right, is that it's all interconnected. We can't numb selectively. We can't say like, oh, I'm numb this area of my life and the rest isn't affected, or we're not boxes. Unfortunately, that's the medical model sometimes treats it that way, like do this one thing or take this one pill. But in an embodied approach, it's all connected. So yeah, your desire to have beautiful flowers or to go outside and be in the fresh air, or to have your partner, a certain kind of conversation with your partner, it's all tied to sex, because it's all tied to that inner voice that is looking to guide you, which lives inside of your body. And that is the voice of the erotic. The voice of the erotic's guiding you. So you might even start by writing your desire list and say, oh, like I want a decaf latte in the morning. And you think like, how is this going to help my sex life? But try it and see what happens. So that's how you can start exploring your desire. And then as you start hearing that voice more and more, start seeing, what does it say in sex? What is it asking for? And am I willing to say it? And most often what that voice is asking for is not the sex that we're used to, or certainly not the sex that we see, might have been trained towards in porn or sex ed or Cosmo magazine, but it could be something very different. And if we're willing to listen, our bodies can guide us there. So that's why the intimacy with that inner voice is so important.
Yes, and even starting small, right? Just because that voice wants to be
Absolutely.
acknowledged. So whether today it's I want flowers, to give it that's how you
Yeah.
start.
If someone says
Beautiful.
chai with coconut milk is helping towards my desire, amen. You can have it.
Excellent. Okay, I'll just ask you one more here, Justine.
Yeah.
Someone asked, they're experiencing some fear around sex because of pain and some trauma as well. So how
Mhm.
would you what would you tell folks who want to feel safer and relax as well?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you one really practical thing, and it's the idea of setting a container. A container would be like a certain location and amount of time in which you're willing to explore something. Like when you go to therapy, you have a 50-minute container, on Zoom or in a room with a therapist. Or if you go to a salsa dance, you say yes to one dance. It lasts so long and then it's done. So in the realm of sexuality, you could set a container with your partner if you have one and say, literally, and I'm going to actually say this, set a timer. Say for 10 minutes, we're going to set a timer and we're going to go into the place where we feel safe. Maybe it's the bedroom, and set the timer. And we're going to set some parameters. For 10 minutes, I want you to touch me lightly all over my body and nothing else. And to start exploring. And when the timer goes off, even if you're loving, stop anyway and build trust with yourself and your body and your partner that it can let go. And you can slowly over time start exploring that way. So give yourself, play with containers. You might have been married 40 years, and I have couples that do this, that they say, we're going to set a timer and 10 minutes, just kiss. And then we're going to go our separate ways for the rest of the day. And we have a safe space in which to explore without pressure, because pressure is one of the biggest killers of the erotic. Pressure and our ideas of what it's supposed to look like. So I really want to encourage you also to play with that. And in a minute, we'll put up my website link. And I have a lot of blogs and short videos and different things on there. You can go and you can read about more of these concepts.
Thank you. Yeah, that idea of the container reminds me of what you were saying earlier about boundaries and how so linked it is to desire.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Beautiful.
that's it.
Thank you, Justine. It's been such a pleasure.